I want to go to my guest since he's here. I'm joined with the one and only Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. My man. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay today?
Jamarl, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show, and I'm alive. How are you?
I'm still kicking. I'm still kicking. I can't complain. There is an article in the Wall Street Journal that I want to discuss with you. For one, it seems like peace negotiations are over with. So you were right. The U.S. president can't eat enough crow to acknowledge that he's failed miserably in his proxy war, despite the fact that he implicitly acknowledges that they've lost. On the second front, Russia seems to be building up additional militaries. So the Wall Street Journal is reporting that there's one in reserve that is getting new equipment, like basically brand new equipment. There's another one on the Finnish border. That's for obvious reasons. Finland just joined NATO, so they have to ensure that their border with Finland, I believe Norway also. It might be Sweden. I can't see the map in my head. But basically, those countries that is secured. The Army in reserve, what is that going to be used for? I mean, from my understanding, that's new equipment, freshly trained soldiers, ready to go. Garland would say werewolves, ready to take on the Ukrainian military. Is that going to be deployed at some point, or is that standing in reserve in case of an emergency? What is going on with that?
Okay, so this probably comes as a surprise to a lot of people. And the fact that the Wall Street Journal is admitting it, there's me and Brian Berletic and a number of other analysts who have been pointing this out, that Russia has considerable elements in reserve. And now we have that they have not committed to the special military operation. That is, new soldiers, volunteer contract soldiers, specifically signed up for the SMO, who have not yet been deployed to the SMO. And we now know that is two entire armies worth, right? Divisions, multiple divisions worth of troops. And what's more, the Wall Street Journal tells us is that they actually are equipped with better equipment, right? Newer equipment than a lot of what you sometimes see at the front lines in the special military operation. Because the troops and the equipment that is there is considered already good enough to grind its way, right, as Russia has been doing, right, at a pace too slow for some people that are perhaps, overexposed to the 24/7 news cycle and Hollywood movies, and maybe are used to, military operations of the U.S. bombing third world countries over the last, couple of decades. This is the reality of a new, future technology now, near-peer conflict that is, at the end of the day, Russia against all of NATO, and Russia is grinding its way through. So there are two thoughts. There are two different veins of thoughts as to why these troops aren't being deployed. One is that they are deterrent and contingency value. In case that, as the Kiev regime faces some type of collapse, right, in the next 6 months, in a year, whatever, and Russian forces start moving more rapidly, in the direction of Kiev or Odessa, or other, to the Dnieper, then there will come another moment where there will be increasing pressure and hysteria for the West to put NATO forces on the ground in Ukraine to preserve their, some degree of their proxy puts regime. And at that point, that is the crux moment that Russia wants to be prepared for. That is contingency, right? And but also deterrent, right? If the West, if Europe is struggling to cobble together a couple of brigades of non-combat troops to put on the ground as human tripwires in Ukraine, then there's the possibility that that is overkill, right? That unless the U.S. itself gets involved, that those two armies are probably excessive contingency, excessive deterrent, right? And of course, the hope that they, the world would be deterred by this, but there is always the possibility, Trump, whatever aside, or however long this conflict continues, we see that, however much Trump might talk a good game and perhaps even want at some level to radically change things, that the momentum and the entrenchment of hegemony in the U.S. deep state and foreign policy is simply too much for anyone to overcome, much less a slapstick routine like Trump's team.
Yeah,
and half of them are neocons anyway, more than half of them. But I think that militaries prepare for contingencies, and because this is an existential conflict, right? A defeat of Russia in Ukraine by a surging U.S. military force. And let's be frank, if the U.S. was going to do this is something that would take months, right, to a half a year for the U.S. to put enough troops on the ground to be able to go into Ukraine in a big way. Anything more than human tripwires, right? Human tripwires, that's another story. You can get those, you can get troops on the ground quickly. They're just, meat. But that's right. That would, of course, give the Russian government pause even then, because that would be, any response to that would be seen as an escalation to direct and open conflict. And the Russian government has to make a decision. Are they prepared for this? Are the stakes high enough? Are they willing to risk the potential nuclear at the end of the road consequences? But I think that one of the things that has been a bit of a revelation to me over the last 3 years, I did not have a high opinion of the European militaries, but that opinion has become much, much less than it even was before. And I think there will come a point where Russia will say, okay, we don't need these two armies of contingency anymore. The Kiev regime is facing collapse. Now is the time for a rapid advance with advanced weapons for maneuver warfare, right? And because there's not enough left to resist that, could face damage. And that would still then be in a good condition to fight NATO if suddenly the U.S. turned around and assumed the opposite. So I think right now, right, it's reserves. It is deterrent. It is contingency. But there is every likelihood that as this war progresses in the next half a year or a year, that there may come a point where the Russian government will say, okay, we don't need this contingency and deterrent anymore. We're satisfied that NATO is not going to, escalate to a direct conflict, that they're rightfully scared of what the results of that would be, both conventionally and strategically. And then, they're there to put into the special military operation, to inject in and provide, shall we say, a rapid end once the real crumbling along the front line begins, once there are no more Ukrainian reserves at all.
Does this mean going into the West?
No, I don't. No, I absolutely, I do not think that is something that the Kremlin is considering now. At some point in the future, right? Let's say that Russia occupies most or all of Ukraine at some point in the next couple of years, right? Then, if the West continues to conduct an active guerrilla war out of NATO territory, then that might require reassessment. right?
Just be clear. I mean, West Ukraine. And I guess you answered that.
I thought you meant NATO. No,
Yeah,
West Ukraine. Yeah. I think here, I think that because of the fact that the population of West Ukraine is very different from that of East Ukraine, right?
Yes.
That they would resent to a much higher degree, right, rather than welcome, as many do in East Ukraine, a Russian occupation. That said, and I think the Kremlin does not want to go into West Ukraine. But if the Kiev regime retreats out of Kiev and sets up shop in eastern Poland or in Lvov and just still refuses to surrender, refuses an unconditional surrender, then the Kremlin may have to reassess that. They may have to take it all. I think that's where it's going to end. I do not see this regime ever surrendering.
Yeah.
They're Banderite at the core, right? Zelensky, of course, was not a Banderite to begin with, but has obviously internalized all of this. He has spoken publicly about his hatred of Russians, not the Russian government, not the Russian military, but Russians, which included, before this conflict started, at least 20% of his own population, and half of his country, including himself, were Russian speaking, right? Yep. Russian orientated. So, I mean, that's an interesting psychological examination of self-hate there. I think, there would be a lot of work for Freud to have Zelensky down on the couch, talking about edible complexes and so forth. But I do not. I think that this regime is incapable of surrender. It's simply on their principal component of a West Ukrainian nationalist Banderite identity, which is what came to power, right, and has dominated the country since 2014, right, forcing, by banning all political opposition to itself and physically forcing its view on the country. The principal component of that conception of Ukrainian national identity is hatred of Russia. That's it. I mean, it's yes, they don't particularly like Poles and Jews and so forth, and but they don't even have a positive, right, necessarily. It's all spite and hatred of Russia at its core, right? That is what that ideology, Banderite fascist ideology, that is what that identity is all about. Mm-hmm. So I do not think they will surrender, even if Kiev is full. And I think the Kremlin will find itself with no good option, leaving only bad options to choose from. And that option will inevitably lead them to move into West Ukraine as well. I did not think that at the beginning of this conflict. Yeah, I do think that it is more than likely that is where things are going to end, considering how things have gone for the last 3 years, right? The alternative is having West Ukraine become, or some rump Ukraine centered around West Ukraine become a de facto NATO battle platform where the entire population, male population, perhaps female population, is turned into a warrior caste that is continually groomed and raised specifically to fight Russia for NATO. That is intolerable to have Azov and C-14 and these other Banderite groups have already, for the last decade plus, been brought into Ukraine's schools to teach their children. And Russia cannot have the children of Ukraine, even West Ukraine, raised from birth to become Russian-hating Banderite fascists who dream of nothing but the next war against Russia. That is it would be a terrible option to have to move into West Ukraine. But the alternative
is even worse,
right? Unless the West was really willing to drop this, and I do not they've given, certainly Europe has given no indication. And now the United States is starting to show that it is not willing to, agree to Russia's terms to end this conflict either. They're still trying to dictate their own terms and save their proxy regime in Kiev. And they continually talk about peace. Russia doesn't want peace. No, Russia does not want peace on their terms. Russia does not want this conflict to end now, right? They want victory. They want the goals of the special military operation to be completed. And I'm of the opinion, and have been, for some time now, that the goals of the special military operation cannot truly be completed, as they have been many times stated, until this, regime, this Banderite regime that seized power, and overthrew the government and seized power with, Western help in 2014, is rooted out, is removed root and branch. It is a cancer, metastasizing cancer, that must be excised from the Ukrainian political and social body politic, whatever the cost. And the cost is great. I cannot even begin to think where the money is going to come from to rebuild, from Russia to rebuild Ukraine. I don't know where that money comes from.
Would that be Russia's responsibility? Well, I guess it would be if they've taken over all of Ukraine.
Absolutely, it would be their responsibility.
Oh, geez. I'm curious on something else. Putin had a fascinating interview. And the reason why I call it fascinating, so from the West, let me give you the West perspective. Putin is a strong man. He's calculating, devious, can't be trusted. He just wanted to take over all of Europe. He wants to take over all of Ukraine just for shits and giggles. No good reason. It's just because he's Putin. He's a bad guy because he's a bad guy. But when you listen to him, you get a different take. Like, he comes across coherent, eloquent.
See, to me, you just described Europe and the U.S. leaders. I mean, that is
every, what is that? Every accusation is a confession, right? This interview was slightly different to me. I mean, maybe your take on it is a little bit different. It gave you a window into his thinking, even vulnerability, in a way that you don't see with Putin in his interviews, in the way that he talks. And he talks about, he says, yeah, we don't need nukes. At least we hope we don't. Of course, he's referring to NATO when he said we hope we don't. But saying we have enough might to settle the Ukraine conflict to its quote unquote logical conclusion. And then when he talks about the special military operation, he points out, look, this isn't something we all that much prepared for. We weren't ready in 2014. He says, but effectively that they were forced to face the West by themselves, which, if he's saying it that way, he's saying it under this notion of we were alone. Like, this had risk built into it. When I decided to go in for the special military operation, I did everything I could. With the Minsk agreements, Istanbul agreement, we did everything we could. And this was the choice that I was forced to make. And we had to face all of the West by myself, or by ourselves as Russia. That is fascinating to me. That is a level of vulnerability of, look, man, I didn't know how this was going to turn out. Like, I did this because I was forced to do this. But we didn't have any help in this. And they had all of NATO, with the US to boot, effectively backing Ukraine in this and building up the largest military in Europe. Now, of course, it turned out differently. His fears didn't pan out. They were able to keep the economy intact while considering the military operation. They ended up with allies, China, Iran, for God's sake, North Korea, motivated to the hilt. BRICS, meaning despite that, he's been able to organize the world and organize very close allies that would help either directly or indirectly in this objective. Give me your take in that interview. What did you like? Was there anything that stood out for you? I mean, I'm assuming you watched it, but
yeah,
give me your take.
Okay, so yeah, I think it's important what you pointed out there at the end is that Russia, the Kremlin may have gone into this thinking that it was themselves against the entirety of the Western world. They, certainly what has evolved over the last 3 years is that they were not completely alone, right? In economic and political terms, China, India, and the rest of the BRICS stood by Russia, right? And to a lesser extent, you can speak of that, of the entirety of the rest of the world outside of the West, right? Even the Middle East countries, the Arab states, right? Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, they refused to turn on Russia under considerable, political and economic pressure from the West to do so. In that, the U.S. presented, you have to stop doing trade with Russia, and they said no, right? I mean that there was that threat, and there always has been that threat of secondary sanctions and just the social pressure that was put by the pretense of moral pressure that was put by the West. I mean, it was a full court press, and the rest of the world outside of the West collectively stood and said no. So the biggest arrow in the West's quiver, which was the hope and even the expectation of a Russian economic collapse, never came to fruition. In fact, pretty much the exact opposite happened. And I know, right, we've had statements from the Kremlin, from the economics ministry, from the central bank head, from Putin, that they expected the economic consequences to be worse than they were. I did, right? I mean, I still have a post up on my Twitter right from the beginning of where I expected this all to go. And I spoke of, that there will be economic suffering in Russia, but at the end of it, right, they will be decoupled from the West economically. They won't be able to blackmail us and pressure us. They won't be able to weaponize this financial architecture and controls and trade ever again, right? But I was prepared. My wife and I, when the special military operations started, we made a personal economic battle list, what we would do, things we would have to cut, a gradation of luxuries that we would have to, cut out of our lives. What would happen if one of us lost our job, if both of us lost our job, what we would do, because we thought that there was going to be economic tough times coming, and those economic tough times never came. I mean, moderate inflation, but with steady economic growth as a whole, salaries rising and everything. So that has never happened. We never had to put that. I mean, we weren't going out and buying limousines either, or any car for that matter, right? We don't drive, but I mean, I can't say that we have done hugely better personally, right? But we certainly haven't done any worse, right? Yeah. Which is extraordinary considering, the level of sanctions and economic war and the weaponization of, the entire Bretton Woods plus system that was directed against Russia. So that whole thing, that whole economic war failed. And it failed, one, because everyone underestimated the Russian economy and overestimated the Western economies. Everyone underestimated the value of Russia to the global economy as the single biggest supplier of commodities, oil, food, fertilizer, metals, on and on and on to the global market. And it tells us that all the the big economic brains in and around the White House, in the U.S. blob, really don't understand the global economy very well, right? Yeah. They certainly didn't understand the Russian economy and Russian politics, but they also failed to understand the energy markets. They failed to understand the global commodity markets, and it has to be said that also the fact that the rest of the world outside the West, refused to the US demands, you're either with us or against us. You must stop trading with Russia. And they said, no, we're sovereign countries. Thanks. That's not going to happen. We'll trade with who we want. We don't,
Right.
they may say we don't take sides in this conflict, and the U.S. turned around and said you're either with us or against us, and they're like, okay, whatever. I mean, that was the response collectively from Africa. I mean, in a big way, but many other parts of the world as well. So I think that was the biggest risk. That was, that economic damage would lead to an inability to prosecute the war fully, plus would lead to all kinds of social and political problems at home, right?
Mm-hmm.
People, and that never happened. The opposite happened, right? Social and political will, the population in Russia has rallied around the special military operation and continues to do so in a way beyond any
Imagination.
beyond even the most optimistic expectations, even from people in Russia, from experts, academics. So everything has turned out so well, considering how bad things still are. That is one of the reasons why now, when Russia has all of these relative advantages against the West in this conflict, not to see it through to its complete fruition, because this opportunity won't come again.
And just so we're clear, is that where Putin is? We're going to see it through to its complete.
If
Is
this
that what that
war
means?
has to be
Logical
fought
conclusion?
again in 5 or 10 years, then the West will make great strides to be in a much better position to wage it than they are now. And so that to me is, a terrible logic that, well, then you must get as much as you can, concrete and irrefutable. And at the end of the day, that's going to mean territory, right? That's going to mean the absolute regime change in Kiev, right? And settle for nothing less.
Yeah.
So that is that fear of that economic and political damage being, even more substantial than, the actual conventional conflict in Ukraine. What was, I think Putin's real fear, and I think he expressed that. But the other thing that I got from that interview, right, other than, the, shall we say, the caution, the worry, the trepidation, is his supreme coolness and confidence. And he himself spoke to this, right? That he, throughout this entire conflict, has just been at least during the Biden years, and now we're starting to see the same thing step by step from Team Trump as well, of escalations and provocations to try to get Russia to do something stupid, something that would take the conflict out of the inevitable attrition box that Russia has put the conflict in, right? That at the end of that process, there is an inevitability to a result. So you try to get Russia to do something that will shake up that box. And my God, I mean, I would have responded far more. I mean, I have a shorter temper, quite obviously, than Putin does.
Yeah.
And thank the goddess, that Putin is there. He must. I don't know whether he, gets regular injections of ice water into his veins, right? I don't think it's narcotics. There may be ice water, maybe water directly from the melting Arctic is pumped into his body on a regular basis.
Meditation, yoga.
Maybe that swimming he does every day is polar bear swimming, in icy Epiphany waters or something. I don't know. But he is supremely chill. I mean, like Zen chill. It is and calm and whatever worries he had, he never let them bubble over into the public, right? That was kept private, and he presented the image of a calm, cool, confident leader all the way through this. And I think now, I mean, there's still potential for black swans and escalations and everything, but after 3 years now, and the Russian economy and the society and body politic having weathered everything, the Russian population responding with the enthusiastic enlistment and in the special military operation, showing their belief in it, in the cause, in the purpose. That's got to be incredibly confidence building for Putin, right? I mean, that is where he is now. And while there's still so many things that could go wrong, right? And never ever doubt that. Never, just take a look at Syria, right? Russia won the war in Syria, right? Against Turkey, against the US, against the West, against the GCC when they were, Saudi and UAE and Qatar when they were involved in this, against Al Qaeda and ISIS. Russia won that war and then lost the peace. Yeah. And they lost it catastrophically. So never ever get too confident. And I don't think Putin does, right? I think he's far too rational, cold-blooded, pragmatic for that. But that balance that interview showed that he is able to keep cool and confident, right? But not also getting, the type of I think ridiculous, over enthusiastic expectations of things that Trump, for instance, displays on a regular basis. Everything is always great. Everything's always going to be wonderful. Everything's always huge. And then you're going to solve this war in a day or 100 days or a few weeks, or, bring peace to the Middle East. And then, golden age of American economy, and the Chinese are crushed, and the Indian, all of this, ridiculous braggadocio that Trump has. Putin is the exact opposite of that. He is cool, clinical, cold-blooded, even, professionalism. And I mean, he is. I'm gonna have to clone the man when he dies. I mean, him and Lavrov both. I mean,
Lavrov is fantastic as a diplomat. I swear he is.
It's not that Putin has never made mistakes. When he says, that we weren't ready in 2014, neither was the West. And there was no military in Ukraine at that time. The military was, half of it defected to Russia, to Crimea. The 75% of the Navy did right there. They weren't ready. Was Russia prepared for the sanctions? No, but the Western didn't have that weaponized packages of sanctions ready at that time either, right? They weren't there. And then, so
everything spiraled out.
Things could have been done differently. So I still think that's Putin's mistake. Right. Yeah. But he has recovered from his mistakes to a very significant degree. I think hopefully now he has learned from those mistakes, and the last elements of that naive, romantic idea of Russia as a part of the West is Putin's very, at one point, real Germanophilia. From his time there and his German speaking, his whatever trust in Merkel or whatever it was. I think that has finally been burnt out of Putin, and I certainly hope so.
I got to get to Lend-Lease, and I'm calling it Lend-Lease. I'm calling it a low-key Lend-Lease agreement, the mineral deal. So we've only seen bits and pieces of one part, and apparently there are two secretive papers that hasn't been disclosed. Not to the
And supposedly the reports from Ukraine that they're not even going to be revealed to the Rada when the Rada is asked to ratify this, right?
That's astonishing. And what that tells me is Ukraine is going to get screwed in that deal. And what's wild about it is it's effectively Trump is allowing weapons with the idea that the US is going to be paid back in 20 or 30 years, depending upon what's left of Ukraine. And that's the rub, right?
It's an excuse, right?
Yeah, it's an
There's
excuse to
two
send weapons.
targets of that, right? First of all, it's not hiding the details from Russia because Russian intelligence probably knew the details of it before Zelensky did, right? I mean, let's be honest about that. It's not hiding; it's hiding the details of this from the Ukrainian people, but also from the American people, from Trump's own base, right? This is a way for Trump to continue sending weapons to Ukraine, right, to the Kiev regime, when he told his base that that was it, that he wasn't going to do it anymore, right? Yes, he was going to bring peace, but you know that Zelensky was a beggar, you know, the best, you know, salesman in the world who came and was given money all the time. You know, he mocked him, you know, as a regular campaign stump feature in every little town and rally around the country. You know, he repeated these things. And now, at least in part, this investment fund, right, is, resources investment fund, whatever you want to call it, mineral deal, right? It's a lot more expansive than just that. Even what we know of, even the 1/3 of it that we know, it seems positioned to be a vehicle for the Trump, for Trump to continue to pump or to return to pumping weapons into Ukraine, right? And the Europeans are already the Americans are now back on board with us, and they're coming up with a new round of sanctions together to come on Russia, right? You know, all right, this is over. The game is over. The pretense of diplomacy, right? You know, the belief that Trump was going to do something different, that he was Russia's friend or something like. No, he was trying to save a U.S. proxy regime from the situation that he can see it's inevitably going to end in, right? Yeah, and now the pretense, you know, the gig is up, and he's got a way to. He's got no other option, right? He's obviously chose not. Well, he does. He could have walked away. He's not. That is painfully obvious now. So then it's Biden, 2.0. You know, weapons and money and sanctions on Russia, right? So just we might as well just call him Brandon Jr. because that's who Trump is now, right? That's where it is. This is his conflict now. This is his war, right? He is making that choice. Just in the last week, right? We heard first there was a $50 million arms sale quietly announced to the Kiev regime, and then within a couple days there was another $300 million package for maintenance, supplies, and parts for the Kiev regime's new nascent fleet of F-16s that the Trump administration supplied. And now we have the word that Patriots are going to be sent to more Patriots, right? Because the others have already been destroyed, are going to be sent from Israel and potentially from Europe to Ukraine. And that can only be done with U.S. explicit sign-off and permission. So, you know, here we see, right, we're pumping right back up to where we were in December, right? You know, it's, shall we say, small, quiet steps, but just in the past week, we've seen a number of those steps. So, I mean, the trend is quite obvious, right? They hoped that they could get Russia to agree to, a deal, basically rewarding them with half of what they already had, right? And just for the chance to improve, to be Trump's buddy, that they would, accept this, right? And they were terribly, terribly wrong, of course, and they're not the only ones. I watched a segment of your show last week with a person that I like and have spoken to in the last few weeks about their certainty that Putin was going to sign a peace deal. And I told him on their own show that was never going to happen, right? And that he needs to separate what he wants to happen from what is really happening and where the evidence points to.
I tried to encourage him on the same, by the way.
Yeah, and it's just Russia does not want peace on U.S. terms. They will not accept peace on the U.S. terms. They started this war knowing that really it was a war against the United States. And Trump comes along trying to play, oh, we're just a third-party mediator, and we want you guys to get along, and kumbaya, and I'm just concerned about the beautiful people. Every time I hear that, I get the Marilyn Manson song pumping through my head. The beautiful people, the beautiful people. Right? It's all such a clown show, right? As the man is, there have been already more than 1,000 bombs and strikes on Yemen, right? Yeah, but he's concerned about I guess the Yemeni are not beautiful people.
They don't count. Arabs don't count. Yeah, the Palestinians don't count. They don't count as people. Yeah. All right. Well.